Good afternoon, everybody. It's afternoon here. May not be afternoon when you all watch this. So it was great to see everybody last weekend. I hope that you gained something from that. I'm going to do a presentation here for pruning and give you a lot of the background information that we didn't really have a chance to go through because I really wanted to get you outside and doing some hands-on stuff. So without any further ado, I'm going to get started. Remember, there will be one more quiz to get you finished up. And I think that will be the end of it at this point. I took a look at the schedule, and this is our essentially our last installment of the training. I'll stay in touch with Dan, and we'll see how we can help going forward, meaning me and the Urban Forestry Council, as well as the City of Wilmington. So I hope you guys got something out of the program, and I look forward to working with you all and maybe someday seeing you along the streets of Wilmington. So without any further ado, let me get going with this. I'm sorry, I just want to make 100% sure that I'm actually doing the right screen. So let's get going. Okie doke. All right, so we talked a little bit about pruning, why we prune and such, and certainly the pruning that you guys will be eventually doing for the city has to do with small tree training, and so getting the structure right. But it's good to understand what happens when you make those cuts and why it is so important to know a little bit about what you're doing in order to get to those good practices, so to speak. So I have a little quiz to start out the day for you. True or false? Pruning is based on science. All of you should be saying true. Absolutely. Pruning is fun. Well, of course, that is based on your perspective, but I hope that most of you think that pruning indeed is fun. So I think that's absolutely true. Pruning is straightforward. That's not always the case. So, but in some instances, it may well be very straightforward. In other cases, it might be a little trickier. And that's kind of where the art of pruning comes into play. So true and false. Pruning is easy? Well, it depends. And it certainly depends, again, not only on your perspective, but what kind of plants you're pruning and what you're pruning for. And it's always important for us to remember why we're pruning and why we're taking off a living branch. Pruning is easy? False. It is not necessarily easy. It does take a little bit of work. It certainly takes a knowledge of tree biology and the science behind the cuts, and it does take a sense of art. And that art is the part that often comes later as you move through. Remember, we talked about the angles of the cut and how you have to watch where your saw is pointed and how that saw angles. And that's where some of that art comes in. And you learn that absolutely over time. Bad pruning kills plants. Well, sadly, it does not. So we'll think a little bit about that as we go on, but I did mention that to you. So always remember, it's highly unlikely you're going to kill a plant with some bad pruning. So today we're going to talk about the right plant for the site because that certainly fits into this. We've talked about this a little bit more, but we'll look at it more with regards to actual putting in the right plant. The why of pruning, we'll talk about a little bit of plant bio because you kind of need that again, and taking the big biology we talked about earlier and putting it into context with regards to pruning, and then we'll do a little wrap up. So how does good pruning fit with this healthy tree stuff? Well, if you pick the right plant and you've considered the mature size of that plant and how well it might adapt and how fast it might grow, you can have an idea of how much you might need to prune it over its lifespan, how you might prune it. Do you need to get elevation over the sidewalk or over the street, and so forth. And making sure, of course, once we have the right plant, how do we put it in the site? What's the right soil situation? Are there any space limitations? And certainly, how much money is in your pocket? Well, in this case, how much money is in the city's pocket? And remember, trees grow very differently in the forest, right? They grow with very tall, narrow canopies. They have, and they reach for the sky up here, but they have very few branches down below. And that's kind of the form that we want, because that means that the branches won't be very large in diameter. And when you think of how we plant trees in urban and suburban sites, we have really big trunks and really big branches. And that's because light is unlimited. It goes all the way around the canopy of the tree. And in the forest, that's not the case. So we're trying to find a way to mimic some of those situations out in our landscape. And so these are some Acer freemonii, which is a hybrid of red and silver maple. They are not very well adapted here in the South. It is simply too hot for them. And you see these trees, this is the middle of summer, and you can see a lot of dieback on these trees. And this is because, again, too hot, and these are actually infested with gloomy scale. This is also the same parking lot. We've got some honey locust here. And up north, honey locust would be a great choice for a parking lot tree. Down here, not so much. And this is what they tend to look like. So making sure we're giving them the right spot, making sure we're not putting them in these small little spaces surrounded by the asphalt. We talk about the heat island effect, and certainly this is an island of plants in the middle of a very hot parking lot. Excuse me. So healthy trees hopefully don't require a whole lot of pruning, right? You're going to get that good structure when they're young, and then you're going to hopefully only have to do some crown elevation or things like that to allow them to grow well in whatever site they're in. And you can see these trees are actually planted in very, very poor soil, and these little sprouts up along the trunk of the trees are indicators that that plant is under some stress. You can see how thin the canopies are. And again, we didn't think about the soil here, and that's why we have issues. The tree leaves are very small, they're yellowish in color, and you can see some dieback on these trees. So they will require some pruning if they even live. And sadly, they probably will live, but they won't ever really thrive. Site limitations, where are we putting our trees with regards to not obstacles, but also horizontal obstacles? How close are we putting them to a building? This is a calorie pair. Very common thing to happen here is on these Bradfords, the branch structure is very poor. You have these very narrow branch unions with a bark inclusion here. And what ends up happening is that bark, a piece of that tree actually rips off and fails because of the form of that plant. So, and this is not a very good place to put this tree, of course, but it will survive, and it did get this big because they're pretty darn tough trees. We certainly don't recommend planting calorie or Bradford pear anymore in our trees because they're so invasive. So obviously trying to figure out where is traffic flowing, what do we need to concern ourselves with regards to pedestrian movement as well. And certainly this is a red maple on the left, but it's in a big enough spot that it's not really got too many issues. I find it amazing that the stakes are still there, that they probably staked it with when it was small, but they never were probably able to get them out of the ground. And that's what happens when you use these kind of metal stakes. You need a puller to get them out. I love this picture because, you know, I love trees. You guys know that. But this is certainly a place where I would never consider planting a tree. This is a fairly small site. It's way too small. This is a Zelkova, and you've got utility lines overhead. So there would have been some pruning. It's just, let's not plant something here, because now you have a pretty much dead tree and you're going to have to remove that. And I would put concrete back in there myself. So again, thinking about how much space do trees need? Well, it depends on how big they get. It depends on the species. Some can certainly tolerate some of these very small planter areas pretty well. Others are not doing so well. And that is certainly a factor of an increasing heat cycle in the South, especially over, of course, the summer periods. So this is a Zelkova again, and I see a lot of Zelkovas not performing well. And frankly, I don't recommend Zelkova as a tree to plant in an urban area at all anymore. So before we actually plant something, we want to make sure we're selecting good nursery stock. And hopefully you're not going to be buying the plants, but hopefully whoever's buying those plants for the city are doing that. And I certainly suspect, knowing Aaron, that they're buying good quality trees from hopefully North Carolina nurseries. This is a honey locust, again, not here in the South, but they're meant to have multiple leaders. That's pretty common for honey locust. It's been staked. It's not a terrible stake job, but it's okay. This is a maple on the right. This is here in North Carolina in Garner. And this is certainly a tree that I would never have taken back from the nursery. I can prune this to fix it, but it essentially has three main leaders, and they will be a problem for this shade tree in the future. So before you start doing any cutting, you want to find out why you're pruning. What is the purpose of the pruning? Are you thinning the tree? Are you reducing the size of the tree? Are you elevating the limbs? What exact reasons are you pruning them? And remember, pruning of ornamental plants is very different than pruning of fruit trees. Fruit trees are going to be pruned for the very reason of producing fruit. So that means they're creating these structural branches that are going to be in full sun so that flowers bloom and you get good fruit on them. I would ask you guys, if you were here, does anybody have a guess what plant species this is? And this is an amazing plant. It's here in Garner somewhere. I crashed by the side of the road, not really crashed, but I stopped by the side of the road to just look at it because I was so amazed and take this picture. This is actually a firethorn, and certainly a pretty cool, pretty darn cool plant. You know, a pyracantha is the genus of this. And this was about 15 or so feet tall and 20 plus feet wide. Just incredibly beautiful. We don't plant a lot of these. They do get fire blight, which is a serious problem, but they also have a lot of thorns and they're not easy to prune because of that. So the next question you ask yourself is, can the plant tolerate that pruning? These fire thorns are pretty pruning tolerant, right? They can actually be espaliate or shaped into whatever kind of shape you might want them to. They're pretty easy to maintain in that regard. This one was just kind of let go naturally. How will the plant respond to pruning? And we'll talk about different pruning cuts and how plants respond to those different types of cuts. And then we want to ask, what's its function in the landscape? Because that's going to make your decision about what to prune and how to prune a little bit more specific to what you're doing. So the why, again, of pruning trees, these are some really good reasons you should be pruning. Certainly the primary one I've talked to you about is maintaining good structure and developing that when the tree is young. And that means you're taking off branches so there'll be a small pruning wound. As the branch gets bigger, every time you take a branch off, that wound is going to be much larger. And so you're hopefully kind of mimicking what trees do themselves naturally in the forest. And we have to kind of do that for them in the landscape. And so that's what we're looking to do, is how do we get that tree to look more like a forest tree? And a lot of the branches you'll see are what we call temporary branches. They won't be there when the tree actually matures. So one of the other things you're looking at is good spacing between the branches. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. And that's a thinning or removal cut. You want to prune to maintain health. Right now, I always get a kick out of this when I see people say, you want to remove dead, broken, diseased branches, right? And they tell you that when you first buy a tree. Well, I'm not going to buy a tree that has a lot of dead or broken or split or diseased branches. I'm going to buy a very healthy tree. But if you end up having a tree that has issues, you may need to do this type of pruning. You're going to prune for flower and fruit. Most of this will be actually for shrubs, for what we would do. But certainly, as I said, for the production of apples or peaches or whatever, you're going to prune very differently to accomplish that. Excuse me. So you also are going to prune to direct growth or control the size. And the controlling of the size might be mostly for shrubs, but of course, some people put the wrong tree in their yard and then they realize this thing's going to get way too big. And now what am I going to do about it? So there's different types of pruning that you might employ in order to make that happen. So there's two key rules with pruning that we want you to know about. One is that plants do not heal. Remember, I told you won't hear me use that terminology. You'll hear me use the word seal or close over those wounds. That's what trees do. Healing is the repairing of tissue as well as the replacement, but trees only actually do the replacement. They don't repair the cells that are damaged. They also defend themselves with various chemical and physical barriers inside the plant, and I'll show you one here in a little bit. But that's in order to kind of contain decay and pest problems, and it's also to keep them out of from getting into the plant, essentially. So just remember that we do pruning for us. The tree doesn't care. It doesn't care if we prune it or not. We are doing it for us. And so usually it's for safety reasons, often, of course, for aesthetics. But as I mentioned, we grow trees in locations foreign to them. So we kind of want to try to mimic what happens to them in the forest. So a little bit of tree biology. You need to know where the terminal buds are. So these two are terminal buds. These happen to be red maple. They are oppositely arranged, if you remember back to our plant ID section. And so what would happen if you were to remove these terminal buds? Well, you're going to get sprouting from the lateral buds. And that might be fine, but you also will be essentially creating a shrub on a stick if you remove those terminals, because those terminals control what happens to the laterals below. So these are lateral or axillary buds. Phyllotaxy, remember phyllotaxy is a term that defines the leaf, bud, or branch arrangement. And we know there are typically 3: alternate, opposite, and whorled. You also might have sub-opposite. Well, I'll show you in a second. This is a wisteria, wow. This is a forsythia in the top here. You can see the bud clusters here. They're opposite from each other. Here we have a Chinese pistache. It has an alternate leaf arrangement. Okay, sub-opposite. That means they're not exactly opposite, but they're not alternate either. And there are a couple that are sort of like that. Mostly fringe tree has buds like this, sub-opposite. You might have some lagerstromia or a crepe myrtle that have that, as well as loropetalum on some parts of the plant, not all of it. So why is it so important? Because it has everything to do with how you prune. This is an oppositely arranged plant. This happens to be a hydrangea. Notice you have 2 buds here on either side. So if you wanted to shorten this for some reason, you're going to take it back to these buds. And so here I've made that cut. Now, if I left it there, both of these buds would sprout, but I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to take off the smallest bud, and you can do that with your fingernail in most cases. It's a lot easier to prune alternately arranged plants. This is an elm, actually, so the buds are alternate from each other. If I want to shorten this stem, you see I've cut it back to here, this lateral, so it grows in that direction. Say I wanted it to grow in the other direction. Well, then I'd come back further and let it prune it back to this point right here. So keep in mind that branches and trunks are made of very similar stuff, right? They're made of wood. And so they have a similar structure. They have a similar function. But we talked about these connections when we did our pruning. And remember, they tend to be stronger below because of the branch collar, then a little weaker above where the branch bark ridge is. So the branch collar is that union of the trunk and branch, and it's very important to understand that when we talk about pruning. As you all know, the branch bark ridge is in here, in this area right here, and that is an area kind of raised bark, and so often very, very obvious. In some cases, it might not be. So there's our branch collar, there's our branch bark ridge. Remember, we talked about what happens if you make a flush cut. A flush cut essentially would be if you cut straight down through this instead of cutting it at the branch collar. And what you see here is this little darkened kind of pointed area on each of these branches. This is the branch protection zone. And if you do a flush cut, you're removing that branch protection zone. You're going to make a much bigger cut, number one. And number two, you're going to allow fungal organisms and spores and such to get into the plant and potentially cause disease. So we don't want to make flush cuts. This is what happens inside the plant when you have a flush cut. You end up with these hollows. Doesn't mean it won't live and get big. It just means you may have a hollow portion of the plant. Okay, so we're trying to prevent that kind of decay from happening. So what should you remove? Well, obviously we are going to take off any dead limbs. You're going to take off codominant leaders. This is that same maple I showed a little bit earlier. So here's our main stem. We would take off at least one of these others and potentially subordinate or shorten one of the others. And I'll talk to you about that, what that means. We did mention it last Saturday. So you want to take some inward facing branches out. You don't want to get too crazy here because the tree will shade them out itself. You don't need to always remove those. Of course, broken, dead, or diseased branches come off. Suckers come off from the base of the tree as well as along the stem. And then if you need to control kind of which direction some of the branches are growing, then you can do that sort of pruning as well. So here's a branch on a tree. This should have been removed a long time ago. These are two stems. I'm sorry, I said branch, but these are actually two stems. They're pretty close to the same size. They're both very upright. So if we were going to remove this, we would do our 3-cut method. I would make a cut kind of up here. You see where my arrow is. I'd cut the weight off, and then I'd make my final cut down here. Now, because you don't know where the branch bark ridge is or the collar, because it's not evident, because it's not a branch, this may not be connected here. So you might work your way down a little bit and finally end up taking the final cut down here. And so you're going to make it as small as possible, but slightly angled so that the water pours off of there. But there's no real 45-degree angle business here because there is no collar or branch bark ridge here. Now, there are three primary types of pruning cuts we would do on trees. One is a reduction cut, and you can see that in this top picture. That means you're shortening the branches. Sometimes we also call this subordination. All right. So they're taking off this main stem, cutting it back to that lateral that's at least 1/3 to 1/2 the diameter of what you're taking off, so that it can take over food producing activities for the one you're removing. Notice there's no collar here where you're taking it off, but you are trying to take it off with a 45-degree angle back to that branch bark ridge, and as well as keeping it as small as possible. Now, a heading cut is essentially taking off that same end of that branch, but at a random location. You're not taking it back to the lateral, you're just making a cut. And this is what we do, you see oftentimes when they're doing things, when they're topping crepe myrtle trees or doing any kind of topping for that matter. Removal cuts means you're doing what we showed you how to do last weekend. You're making a removal cut at the collar, angled with regards to the branch bark ridge. So those are the three primary cuts. Now, what happens when you do that to a plant? It's important to understand how the plant will respond. So if you look at this, the first column, it invigorates existing interior foliage. Does it or not? Reduction cut, yes. Removal, yes. And heading, yes. So that means you're opening up the canopy a little bit to allow more light to get in there, so you might invigorate some of that interior foliage, which is a good thing, right? More foliage, more food produced. Does it induce sprouting? Well, with the reduction cut, typically yes, because you're not cutting it at the natural boundary or target. Removal cut, maybe, right? You're cutting it at the collar. If on certain species like crab apples, sometimes cherries, sometimes crepe myrtle, it'll sprout no matter what you do, no matter how good your cut is. A heading cut, absolutely. That's what you're encouraging, is sprouting. So you're cutting it at a random location to shorten it, and you're going to get a bunch of sprouts coming out there. They are dormant buds that will begin to sprout. Are you reducing the density of the crown? For most cases, yes, you are. But heading, you're actually making it bigger. Are you reducing the height? With the reduction cut, yes. Not typically with the removal cut. You're really taking it off at the sides. You might be reducing the width of the plant, but you're not reducing the height any. On heading, absolutely. That's the point and why most people do that kind of pruning. Reducing the width, typically, as I said, with reduction, somewhat with removal cuts, and certainly somewhat with heading cuts, because again, you're cutting a lot of vegetation off of the tree when you do a heading cut. And heading cuts are very common on shrubs, right? That's how we shear plants. Those are heading cuts. Doesn't mean they're bad on shrubs, but they are not the best thing on most trees, and that's certainly not what we recommend doing. Are you cutting back to a natural boundary? As I said, with the reduction cut, sort of, you're getting it back at least to the branch bark ridge, but not to a collar. With the removal, absolutely. With heading, absolutely not. Okay, so knowing those three cuts and how things are going to happen. So a removal cut made at the collar, right? Here's this upper arrow, the branch bark ridge. Here's the collar down below. So you're going to make your cut right essentially through here. Again, the 45-degree angle would apply here. So you see where I've made my cut and about where you have that angle. All right. These are cuts that are looking pretty good. They were made a number of years ago. On many evergreens and pines especially, you'll see that it looks like they almost go, your cut almost is straight down. So when they start looking like a belly button, we know we've made a pretty darn good cut, and it will close over. And eventually, as that tree continues to grow, you will not see that cut anymore. There will always be a knot in there, but as long as you've made a pretty small cut and done the best you can, then essentially you're going to, you're not going to be able to see it, but you'll have a good solid knot. If you make a bad cut, you might have more of a decayed knot. Okay. Natural target pruning. This is what I showed you how to do for removal cuts. There's sometimes in the past were called thinning cuts as well. There's our branch bark ridge. There's our branch collars are where the yellow arrows are. The 3-cut method I showed you, make your slight undercut, remove the weight, and you'll see what I meant about kind of making that jump cut if you do that right. So this goes in at just about the right depth for the size of that branch, and the branch kind of jumps right off of there. And then you make your 45-degree angle cut back at the branch collar. As I mentioned, these are good cuts. These are belly buttons. These are on some sawtooth oak that campus trimmed on NC State's campus. And now, this was in 2007, I took those pictures. Now you cannot see those wounds at all. They have completely grown over and developed wood on the outside of them. This little cut on the bottom is very close, but I want you to think about what did they maybe do slightly incorrectly. They got a little too close to the branch bark ridge here, so the angle was off a little bit. But it's a small wound. It's a young, vigorous tree. This wound will likely close over. And what you see here is that donut of wound wood roll, and it rolls over that wound and forms that belly button, and then completely hidden later. So this is kind of really bad pruning here. This is done by what they call a stick chain, and that's a chainsaw that has, you know, the motor here and a long pole, and it has the chain out at the end. And, you know, it's heavy. It's hard to control sometimes. And sadly, the guys who did this pruning were lawn care guys that said, oh, we know how to prune trees. And what you see here is an evidence that they actually did not know how to prune trees. You see where they lost control and they've nicked the bark in a bunch of places. They've made really bad cuts. They've chewed it up. They've made flush cuts. Just sad. They took off 3 limbs with one. I guess that's efficient, but these are both flush cuts and will not close over and will allow disease organisms to get in there. I don't know what they were doing here. They probably just cut it off and it ripped right down there at the base. Excuse me, luckily they didn't get any more bark tearing than what you see here. Leaving a stub, and of course they left stubs, as well as look how far down they ripped that bark because they just cut it off without making that undercut. Topping again is a heading cut, but when it's done on very large plants, you end up with this kind of action. These are some river birch that were in Food Line Shopping Center here in Garner where I go, and you can see how these were cut back just to a random height. I don't know why they did it, because if you look over at the other side of the parking lot near the bank, you can see what those trees actually look like. They were absolutely gorgeous. So they brought in a company all the way from, I believe it was Alabama, to do this pruning for them. Why, I don't know. Maybe they had a deal with the Food Lions to come in and top their trees. Well, they ended up removing them all. So they have no trees in the parking lot at all now, except maybe a few crepe myrtle along the edge. And this just made me very, very sad. It was unnecessary pruning, but that's what they look like up close. Certainly, this is a crepe myrtle in the upper left here. That is very common pruning. We know for that. This one on the right is a Bradford pear. Sadly, I don't care how badly you prune Bradford pear. Cut it down here at the ground, though, is the best way to prune it. But you can see how they prune them. Are these dead? Absolutely not. They will sprout back. But seriously, this is still what we're seeing out there. If you want to shorten a crepe myrtle, that's perfectly acceptable. What you would do is actually you would do a topping cut like you see here, and I'll explain this to you in a little bit. And then you would do what we call here is pollarding, and I have the spelling for that in a second. So this is a crepe myrtle growing at the Manteo Gardens. The Elizabethan Gardens in Manteo. If you ever get a chance, go check it out. It's a beautiful place to hang out. But these are like 40-plus-year-old crepe myrtle, and these are pruned correctly. These are pollard heads, and I'll show you another example. So this is what we call pollarding. So they decided that when the tree reached this height that they wanted to pollard them. So they cut them back, and notice these kind of round fat areas are what we call the pollard head. And so when you go back to prune these, all you're doing is using a little hand pruner, and you're taking off all of these little sprouts. So imagine there were a few of them at this location. Imagine how long it takes to do one tree. It's a lot of work. It's a very common practice in Europe. Well, a lot of Americans don't care for it. I like it. It's a different kind of pruning, and if done correctly, it can look pretty cool. So I've taught the students how to do this kind of pruning. So you would take a tree like this, you would prune off at whatever height you choose to prune it off at, and then you would allow it to sprout back kind of as a shrub. So that's how we essentially do, we start the pollard cut. But you never come back and make a clean cut again. Let me go back a second. Once you've made that cut and you get that pollard head formed, you never come back and shorten it any further than that. You're only ever cutting these off now with hand pruners. So that's what makes it so labor intensive. Start pruning trees when young. This is a great example of a shade tree with one main leader, and then the rest kind of are subordinate to it, and it's shaped sort of like a triangle, right? That's what we're looking for. This is a pecan behind Kilgore Hall. It's quite large now, but notice those branch angles and the spacing. This is good spacing. This is a good angle. These are not going to have bark inclusions and are going to develop a strong attachment. So we want to match the strategy of pruning to the age of the trees. And so this is an ash. This is growing, of course, in a tree lawn, but these lower branches need to be cleared over the road so trucks can move through there without pruning them. And of course, people won't get hit in the face. So you want to match the amount of pruning that you do and the maximum amount of foliage that you can take off to maximize growth rate, but you want to be sensitive to how old the plant is. So young shade trees in the landscape, notice that again, that beautiful pyramidal shape. So here I would start elevating the limbs. That means taking off some of these lower limbs so that somebody who's going to mow the grass isn't going to get hit in the head and get upset and break those things off. Certainly I would have a mulch ring down here, at least as big as the drip line, but that's just me. And so you don't need to remove any codominant leaders here. There aren't any on this particular plant, but if there were others competing for this, you would subordinate or shorten them again to try to get this pyramidal shape. You might remove a little bit of interior growth, but you're also going to start thinking about how am I going to space these branches out. So you're looking to build that skeleton or structure of the tree for what it will be when it gets older. Notice how much you can take off, and that's about 50% of this crown because it is young and is established in the site and healthy. We don't do that right at planting. This is, of course, in a nursery, and you notice they're working to get the shape down. They have a few more years of pruning to get more of these side branches cut. They only have the one leader, and they've got, they often use bamboo to hold these up. These are limbed pretty low. Usually when somebody buys the trees, like if Wilmington bought trees, they would ask them to be cleared up to 6 feet above the root ball. That's because that makes it easy for them to install and then manage them once they're in a streetscape particularly. But a lot of nurseries will allow these lower branches to grow, and they kind of thin it out here at about that 6 foot mark, because what they'll do then is they'll prune these off before they are sold, about a year or 6 months before they're sold. And what happens is these smaller branches allow the tree to help build taper. So that means it's going to get bigger in diameter, but it's going to be tapered. So that helps the tree blow in the wind. Very important. So young tree pruning. When you take a look at this, is a mess. This is a small flowering tree, though. This is a red buckeye. How do I know that? I see the buds right here. I know that they're oppositely arranged, and I know that you often have a false terminal here where the flower cluster used to be. What would we do here? Well, you don't have much choice. I would rather remove this branch here in the middle of these two, but it would be far easier to come up and remove this one from the bottom. But because you have bark inclusion here, you really need to get rid of that. So there's a couple things going on here, but remember, this is not a shade tree. This is a small maturing plant. Now, this was a shade tree, and you can see it has two main stems, two dominant leaders. and they're exactly the same size. They're not attached well. And when you have bark in between there, what'll happen is they'll put more and more pressure on each other until they finally, something gives and something splits apart. And so this is almost too late to do this, because you're going to make about a 3-inch diameter cut on a tree that's only probably about 5, maybe 6 inches in diameter. Notice all these little holes and these marks. These are from yellow-bellied sapsucker. So I'm imagining this tree is probably not doing very well at this point. So it most likely needs to be removed and replaced. Here's a great example of a willow oak with at least 2 main leaders. You can see one going straight up. You can see one here. And you can also see at the top of the canopy, there's not a whole lot up there that, there's a bit of competition up here. So we want to pick the most straight one. We're going to shorten some of these back. We might do a removal cut. This I would subordinate. That means I would take it back possibly to about right here. Subordination slows the growth of that branch down. And that's really important to buy you some time to decide, do I want to remove it all the way back to the main trunk? Of course, rubbing branches, we know, come off at any time. Again, bad pruning practices right here. This was the same guys with the stick chain. Medium-aged, semi-mature trees, you're going to continue to make sure we got that one dominant trunk. You're going to shorten some branches below that first, the first permanent limb. That means you might also be removing some of those. We want to do that early on. We don't want branches growing straight up into the canopy. Again, it depends on where you are and what kind of pruning you're doing. Would a tree like this need to be pruned heavily in a cemetery? Probably not, right? So we have to keep that in mind. So this is what I've been using the term subordinate, anything that's aggressive. So look at how wild these branches are growing out. And we don't really have, we at least do have a main terminal. Now, what they don't show you is this one kind of going straight up here. I would actually cut that back to the main stem. Notice how they shortened some of these really large ones. They didn't take them all the way off though, because again, they're trying to build that trunk taper. So they need those lateral branches on there. Eventually, these will all be removed. Medium-aged trees, again, you're going to start trying to space those branches 18 to 36 inches apart. You're going to reduce the length of anything that's really overextended, rubbing and touching branches. You're going to try to fill in any gaps potentially in the ground. But notice the reduction in how much you can take off. It's half as much as on a young tree. So the pruning dose should be no more than 25%. So again, you're looking for this good branch spacing. And this is a great tree. This is a sycamore. You notice how the branches are spaced out and circle kind of around the entire trunk as they go up. We don't want them all at the same location on the trunk, and that ends up with big problems. Now, mature trees, we should be removing dead primarily. You might reduce some overextended branches, or especially those that have bark inclusions, because we don't want to put any more pressure on that branch attachment. So you want to remove as little amount as live tissue as possible, right? To get to whatever your reason for pruning that tree is. You might also do some restoration pruning if there's been storm damage or the tree's been over pruned. You can restore trees that have been topped. You just have to know what you're doing and know how long it's going to take you. Notice the percentage. Now we're down to 10%. And we always want to stay well below that. And so you have to really consider the age of the tree and the status of the tree. How healthy is it if we're going to start doing that pruning? Of course, removing dead wood and storm damage, right? So you're going to take these back to laterals that can take over the growth of the plant, right? That's pretty straightforward. Here, you don't know. You might take this branch off down here further. It depends on where the lateral is. You may not have a lateral, so you may end up just wanting to clean it up. If there's a bark rip all the way down here, you're going to take it back. If there's not a lateral till way back there, you might have to take it back to there, or maybe you just do a topping cut because you have to, and allow that to sprout out from there. This one, of course, we'd remove back to this lateral. Same thing here. You can cut this off to the lateral. So, excuse me, it's a case-by-case situation. So remember, pruning dose. Anything over 50% for young trees, over 25% for medium age, and over 10% is what we consider severe pruning. And that can lead to excessive sprouting, and that excessive sprouting can lead to long-term issues with the plant. It's using up excess energy in order to do that. So we only want to do as much pruning as absolutely has to be done. So when we talk about pruning, we want to make sure we're siting trees, we're planting the best trees in those sites. We're doing planting and pruning that's proper to maintain the health of those trees. And we want to start really early in the life of that plant, because that's really important to what we're trying to accomplish, particularly what you all are trying to accomplish. And so here's my information again, in case y'all don't have it. You're always welcome to email me. If you go to this site here, this website, you'll find publications on pruning, and you'll also find some very nice videos that I've done on pruning, as well as planting. So gives you some great places to go. So I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to finish up there. I actually thought about one thing that I don't think I talked about yet, and that's compartmentalization of decay in trees. And I think I'll try to put together a very small presentation for you all on that. All right, thanks. I hope you all are having a great day.